I had a dream about a mountain, rocky and solitary, like a guardian towering above its surrounding peaks. Majestically, it cleaved through the night sky with its sharp contours, while the full, clear moon illuminated its slopes with shimmering light. An old road, like a scar on an old man's face, cut through one of the slopes. This road, once a guiding thread for travelers and merchants, was now forgotten and abandoned, barely noticeable beneath a layer of snow, with weathered stones occasionally peeking through the white veil. To the right of this road rose a cliff, impassable and grim, like an unwavering sentinel guarding the mountain from all adversities. To the left stretched a chasm, dark and unfathomable, reminding of endless emptiness. Strong winds repeatedly crashed into the mountain, howling in futile fury. At that moment, reality brutally invaded my consciousness. "Get up, rabbles! Rest is over!" commanded the guard, rudely interrupting my sleep. His kick was cruel and merciless, forcing me back to the grim reality. Opening my eyes, I saw the gray, cloud-covered sky, which seemed infinitely distant and cold. My body responded with pain to every movement, and the worn-out prison robe barely protected me from the piercing wind. The pain in my wrists, tortured by iron shackles, was particularly agonizing, as they seemed even colder and more merciless with each gust of wind. I looked up and saw a long chain stretching along the road up the slope. Dozens of people were chained to it with small intervals, each of them, like me, a prisoner of their fate. Ahead of me walked a man with broad shoulders, his back covered in bloody wounds, yet he marched confidently and without hesitation. Behind me followed a sharp-looking guy, nervously looking around and muttering to himself in a language unfamiliar to me. From time to time, armed guards passed by, dressed in warm fur coats and cloaks, their gazes full of contempt and threat. No matter how diligently I tried to distract myself from my grim situation, reflections on the past returned me to the bitter reality. 2 years ago, getting involved with dubious individuals, I found myself drawn into a whirlwind of events that resulted in being accused of murder, a crime I had no connection to. Now, surrounded by other prisoners, I walked along the snow-covered pass, unsure of what lay ahead. My thoughts were interrupted when I lost my pace and stumbled, dragged down by the weight of my despair, pulling the chain that bound us all. "Hey, blind or something? Watch where you're going," exclaimed the fair-haired guy walking behind me. His voice sounded irritated, as if he sought a reason for quarrel to alleviate the monotony of our journey. Tired from lack of sleep and food over the past 2 days, I managed to quickly regain my balance. However, before I could fully recover, my clumsiness again became evident, prompting the same guy behind me to express his displeasure. "You idiot, I'll kill you," he shouted angrily. The broad-shouldered man ahead of me merely smirked, and without turning around said, "Why bother? This weakling will die by dawn anyway. The mountain will kill him." After a few seconds, he added, "The mountain will eventually kill you and me too. Just a little later. I really don't know what the guards are thinking, making us walk in such cold." His words were a grim reminder of the harshness of our conditions and nature's indifference to human suffering. The blonde guy seemed to have cooled down a bit. "Speak for yourself, idiot." "I plan on surviving," he retorted. His determination sounded convincing, but in our situation words meant little. I silently shook my head and focused on not falling again, thinking, what a charming pair. Suddenly, a third voice chimed in from somewhere behind me and joined the conversation. This voice sounded soft and intelligent. "Usually at this time of year it's much warmer here. We just got unlucky. Besides, I would advise you not to harm this guy." "Why's that?" the blonde guy asked, suspicion evident in his voice. Haven't you heard about him? He's not like us, who ended up in prison because of debts, crimes, or misfortune. He's not from our league. This guy is from a gang of night rippers." The broad-shouldered man, now intrigued by the conversation, glanced back. "So what? Why should we be afraid of some gang member? Look at him. What can he do to me? That gang is known for its insane cruelty and bloodthirstiness. There might be other members among us. We're not protected here by anything or anyone. Do you really want to risk angering this gang?" The broad-shouldered man chuckled, unwilling to respond. The conversation among the prisoners abruptly ceased as a young guard approached us. He looked quite imposing in his leather jacket, wielding a baton. But there was no hint of cruelty in his voice. Rather, a sense of concern seemed to permeate it. "What's going on here?" he asked, surveying the prisoners. His gaze was filled with worry, which came as a surprise to everyone, including myself. A silence hung in the air until one stepped forward to respond. A prisoner with a gentle and calm voice. "Nothing much, sir. Just fatigue and cold getting to us, especially to our young friend over there." He nodded in my direction, and the guard's gaze shifted, filled with pity. "What are you looking at?" echoed in my mind, though I didn't dare to voice the question. The guard sighed, unclipped a flask from his belt, and handed it to me. "Bear with me a little longer, boy. We'll stop for the night soon. In the meantime, here, have some water." How kind of him, I thought to myself, appreciating his gesture. My thin frame and short stature, results of malnutrition, often led others to see me as significantly younger, which sometimes worked in my favor. But now, on the brink of being labeled almost a child, it only irritated me. Nevertheless, I was desperately thirsty. Just as I reached for the flask, a whack of a baton cut through the air, and I felt a sharp pain. Stumbling, I once again pulled the chain, eliciting curses from the blond guy behind me. In the shadow of the abrupt and authoritative behavior, another guard, older and more stern than his younger counterpart, took position nearby. The blow I felt in my back was his doing. He didn't even bother to look at us prisoners, but his gaze, full of contempt, was directed at the junior guard. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice sounded like a verdict, filled with dissatisfaction and authority. The young guard, as if caught in the act, instantly faltered. "I was just giving this guy some water." His defense sounded unconvincing even to himself. "He'll get water along with the rest of them when we set up camp." The senior guard cut off any attempt at objection. "But," the young one began, only to be immediately interrupted. "Shut your mouth! These prisoners are not your friends. Got it? They're not even considered human. If you start treating them like humans, they'll take advantage of it." The young guard, with a glance of regret towards me, hung his head and returned the flask to its place. "If I see you trying to befriend them again, rookie, next time you'll taste my baton." The threat from the senior guard was punctuated with a swing of his baton as he passed by us, leaving an atmosphere of threat and tension in his wake. I watched him go, harboring silent resentment. I don't know how, but I'll be watching as you're the first to meet your end, I thought to myself. Then I turned my head and looked towards the young guard, who walked behind us with his head down. "And you'll be the second," I whispered to myself, anticipating the heavy trials that awaited us ahead. For the next few minutes, I remained in a somber mood. But then, I managed to collect myself emotionally and took a deep breath, trying to savor the fresh air. Indeed, such air was hard to come by where I had lived before. The city where I grew up was burdened with microdust and other pollutants emanating from countless factories and plants, making the air heavy and acrid. On the outskirts where I was born, the stench was constant, and in more affluent areas, despite complex filtration systems, the air seemed sterile and lifeless. Only the truly wealthy could afford to breathe easy and clean air. Yet being in this God-forsaken place now, I could breathe deeply, relishing every gulp of clean, fresh air despite the circumstances. If only it weren't so cold, if my legs, back, and wrists weren't aching from the harsh shackles. As we progressed up the mountain slope, more and more prisoners began to stumble. Some who could no longer continue were detached from the chain and unceremoniously thrown into the abyss, which cut deep into the earth next to us. Watching their final moments, I couldn't help but feel sadness. Peace to their souls, I thought, observing their fall. Unexpectedly for myself, I found that my mood had improved. It was strange to feel relatively well in such a situation, but after many years of living in deprivation and hardship, I had learned to find solace in the little things. Now, as a prisoner, I no longer had to worry about earning money, finding food, or protecting myself from external threats. The worst had already happened, and I had learned not to fear death. Therefore, the prospect of a slow demise in this cold captivity didn't seem so terrifying to me. When the order came to halt the prison caravan and prepare for the night, each of us, exhausted and trembling from the cold, gratefully collapsed to the ground. A spot for the camp was found on a stretch where the road widened slightly, providing some shelter from the wind thanks to a protruding rock. But even that was not enough to warm us in the piercing cold of this grim night. The guards began organizing the camp. Strictly and methodically, they gathered us together in a group so that the warmth of our bodies could help us withstand the cold. In the center of the circle we formed, a fire was lit, its flames immediately becoming the sole source of light and warmth in this darkness. Looking around, I noticed a young guard watching the mountain with a thoughtful expression on his face. What an oddball, I thought. Soon the fire was roaring. The strongest prisoners tried to get closer to the fire, while the weak, like myself, were forced to sit on the outer edge of the circle, with backs chilled from the cold. Naturally, any movement was hindered by the fact that we were still chained together. So the familiar broad-shouldered prisoner remained where he was, despite all his attempts to get closer to the flames. The guards walked among us, distributing water and food. Like everyone else, I received a few sips of icy water and a small piece of hard, moldy pie. Despite its unappetizing appearance, I forced myself to eat it whole, only to remain just as hungry. Apparently, I wasn't alone in this. The blonde-haired criminal who had been walking behind me glanced around in anguish. What is this? We're going who knows where, and they're feeding us scraps. Even in prison, the food was much better. Most of us are doomed anyway. In prison, sure. Execution awaited us, but there must be a limit to how prisoners are treated. A few steps away from us, where the paved road ended and only sharp rocks remained, a cluster of bright red berries grew in the snow. I had noticed them before. They clustered here and there along the road. I even noted how beautifully these hardy berries contrasted against the white backdrop. The eyes of one of the prisoners lit up, and he got down on all fours, attempting to crawl towards them. I wouldn't advise eating those, friend. It was the soft-spoken criminal again. I turned and finally saw him face to face for the first time. He was a tall man in his 40s, slender and strangely handsome, with a dignified air more reminiscent of a doctor than a criminal. It was a mystery how such a man ended up a prisoner, yet here he was. "Here you go again with your advice. What now? Why?" the blonde said. The doctor-like criminal smiled guiltily and continued. "These berries are called Red Death. They grow in these parts. Just a few of those berries could be enough to kill a grown man. Damn it. The blonde convict flinched and glanced at the doctor. I didn't pay them much attention. Instead, looking around, I began to notice that the camp was situated quite strangely. My instincts were on edge. I had always had a keen sense of danger, growing up in an extremely troubled neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, where many criminals and riffraff dwelled. And now all my instincts were signaling a critical situation. And as if in response to my thoughts, a thunderous roar sounded from above. In the next moment, something enormous came crashing down from the sky. Turning towards the source of the thunderous noise, many of the guards and prisoners looked up to see rocks and massive chunks of ice hurtling towards us. Panic engulfed us all instantly. We scattered in different directions amidst the cacophony of screams. Shadows danced gleefully on the black stones as the prisoners, entangled by the thick chain, fell to the ground, dragging others along. I was one of the few who remained standing, mostly due to an innate sense. I automatically prepared for such a turn of events. Calm and focused, I looked up at the night sky and took a sharp step back. The next moment, a chunk of ice the size of a human body fell to the ground right in front of me and shattered, showering everything around with sharp shards. The others weren't as quick. As ice and rocks continued to fall from the sky, many were injured, and some even perished. The air was filled with cries of agony. "Quickly, get up, you idiots! Run to the wall!" The experienced guard, the one who had struck me with a baton several hours ago, shouted angrily, trying to get us to move towards the relative safety of the mountain slope. However, before anyone could heed his order, something massive crashed down, causing the stones beneath our feet to tremble. It fell right between us and the mountain wall, plunging everything around into silence for a few seconds. Initially, the creature looked like an indistinct, massive lump of mud and snow, with the outlines of fangs and claws barely discernible. But as the creature began to straighten its limbs and rise, its size became evident. It was huge and loomed over the rocky plateau. Before us stood an imposing creature, resembling a wolf but much more frightening and grotesque. This creature is probably over 4 meters tall, I thought in astonishment. Tales of ancient ominous monsters had always seemed to me nothing more than legends. But now, unquestionably, a werewolf stood before me, seemingly ready to attack at any moment. The creature stood on its hind legs, displaying its powerful muscular body, slightly bent forward. Its front paws, disproportionately long and ending in sharp claws, seemed particularly menacing. What initially appeared to us as dirty snow was actually its fur, yellowish-gray and tattered, but dense enough to stop bullets. The monster's 2 black eyes with a reddish tint stared intently at the prisoners and guards, sparkling with an insatiable desire to kill, as if assessing each of us as potential prey. Beneath the eyes was an imposing muzzle, crowned with a terrifying, massive mouth, literally bristling with sharp teeth. Thick saliva dripped from its mouth, slowly dripping onto the snow. However, most alarming was watching the werewolf's swollen veins relentlessly pulsating beneath its skin, their movement resembling living tendrils. I could see them vividly because, unfortunately, I was one of those unlucky individuals closest to the monster, getting a front-row view of this nauseating spectacle. Well, this is just too much already, he thought, stunned. As soon as I finished this thought, hell broke loose. The creature lunged, slashing its claws directly towards me. But I was one step ahead. Without wasting a second, I leaped aside, as much as the chain allowed, and positioned the broad-shouldered prisoner between myself and the monster. Years of life on the outskirts, honing my instincts, saved my life. Within a split second, the sharp, sword-like claws pierced through the broad-shouldered man, sending sprays of blood into the air. Drenched in hot liquid, I fell to the ground, and the broad-shouldered criminal, now just a corpse, collapsed on top of me. Damn, why are you so heavy? Temporarily blinded by the fallen body, I heard a soul-chilling roar and felt a massive shadow passing over me. Immediately after, the night was filled with a deafening chorus of screams and gunshots. Paying no attention to the piercing sounds, I tried to flip the corpse onto its side but was interrupted by a strong tug of the chain, wrenching my wrist and flooding my consciousness with sharp pain. Disoriented, I felt myself being dragged to the side for a few steps, but then the chain suddenly loosened and I could move my arms again. Well, it could have been worse. Though, what could be worse than this situation? I thought again. Pressing my palms against the dead man's chest, I pushed with all my might. The heavy corpse stubbornly resisted all my efforts, but eventually toppled onto its side, freeing me. However, before I could celebrate my newfound freedom, my blood ran cold. Because at that moment, as my hands were still pressed against the bleeding body, I distinctly felt something writhing beneath the dead man's skin. His veins began to swell. You just had to think that things could get even worse, didn't you, idiot? I thought, shuddering. Kicking the corpse away with my feet, I crawled away from it as far as I could, about 1.5 meters, thanks to the ubiquitous chain. Quickly scanning around, I noticed a multitude of dancing shadows and the silhouette of the monster raging among the screaming prisoners and guards at the opposite end of the stone plateau. Then my gaze settled on the dead body, which began to convulse with increasing strength. On the opposite side of the body, with a slack jaw and a look of horror on his face, stood that same blonde man. I waved my hand to get his attention. "What are you staring at, fool? Get away from him." The blonde criminal attempted to, but promptly fell. The chain twisted between the three of us, pinned down by the weight of a broad-shouldered man. I clenched my jaws, engulfed by a fear that seemed to have accompanied me all my life. Fear had become an integral part of my existence, almost a familiar backdrop to my wretched life. But the events unfolding right before me were difficult to comprehend altogether. This was a situation I had never encountered before. The feeling I experienced now surpassed simple fear. It was so powerful and all-encompassing that I couldn't even describe it in words. Nightmarish metamorphoses were taking place with the corpse of the prisoner. Strange bony protrusions pierced through the skin, elongating like spikes. Muscles swelled and writhed, as if trying to change their shape. Nails turned into sharp claws, the face cracked and split open, revealing a twisted maw with too many rows of bloodied needle-like fangs. "This is wrong," I shuddered, feeling a strong urge to empty my stomach. "The chain!" suddenly shouted the doctor inmate, just a few steps behind, pointing at his shackles with a ghostly pale face. This remark wasn't particularly helpful, but given the circumstances, his shock was understandable. Being chained in shackles was bad enough, but being shackled to such horror was truly unfair. The werewolf was infecting other people, spawning reduced copies of itself, and I found myself chained to such a creature, my fate always intricately and grimly entwined with me. Since childhood, luck had never been on my side. Abandoned by my mother in one of the most dangerous places on the outskirts of the city, I spent my entire life fighting for survival. I was ignored, beaten, deceived, and often left hungry. Eventually, I joined a gang of night rippers. However, when I saved their leader's life, as a thank you, he betrayed me, sending me to prison to protect his son. And now I stood face to face with a zombie werewolf. My life seemed to be an endless succession of cosmic injustice. Whether it was fair or not, now only one person could save me. That was myself. The broad-shouldered man, or rather what was left of him, slowly rose, his mouth emitting strange clicking sounds. Without giving him time to fully recover, I cursed and leaped forward, grabbing hold of the long, weakened chain. One of the creature's hands, now fully equipped with 5 sharp claws, lunged forward to meet me, but I dodged with a calculated move. I had used this trick many times when trying to evade blows from drunken passers-by in the dark alleys of the city. This time, it wasn't quick reflexes that saved me, but simple composure. Perhaps I hadn't learned any fancy combat moves, but the streets were also a kind of teacher. As I said, I had spent my whole life fighting for survival, and this experience allowed me to keep a cool head in the midst of any conflict. So instead of freezing or being consumed by fear and doubt, I simply acted. Approaching closely, I looped the chain around the creature's shoulders and pulled, pinning its arms to its body. Before the creature, still sluggish and stupefied after the transformation, could react properly, I wrapped the chain several times around its torso, narrowly avoiding the fate of losing my face to the bite of this creature's terrifying jaws. The good news was that the monster could no longer move its arms. The bad news was that I had used up the entire length of the chain to immobilize it, leaving almost no free space between us. "You too!" I shouted, addressing 2 of the inmates. "Pull on this chain as if your lives depend on it." The blond man and the doctor stared at me with confusion. Then, realizing, they began to move. Grabbing the chain from opposite sides, they pulled with all their might, compressing the monster and preventing it from breaking free. Good, I thought. The monster tensed its muscles, trying to break free. The chain creaked, catching on the bony spikes, slowly tearing apart. Darn, not very good. Without wasting a second, I raised my hands and wrapped a short, thinner chain around the creature's neck, connecting the shackles. Then, with quick steps, I circled around the monster and pulled, finding myself back to back with it, as far away from its jaws as possible. I knew I wasn't strong enough to strangle a person with my bare hands, let alone such a strange, horrifying mutant that was trying to eat me. But now, using my own back as a lever and the weight of my entire body to pull the shackles down, at least I had a chance. I pulled down with all my might, feeling the monster's body pressing against me, and the bony spikes digging into my skin. Oof. Painful. The monster continued to struggle, clicking its fangs loudly and trying to break free from the chain that was crushing it. Now it was just a matter of finding out what would break first, the chain or the monster itself. Sweat and blood dripped down my face as I pulled and pulled down again with all the strength I could muster. Every second felt like an eternity. My strength and endurance, what little I had, were quickly fading. My bruised back, wrists, and muscles pierced by the bony spikes throbbed in agony. And then, finally, I felt the monster's body go limp. Breathing heavily, I fell to my knees. My whole body felt like it had just been through a meat grinder. Even a large dose of adrenaline couldn't rid me of all the pain and exhaustion. And yet, I was alive. 3 seconds. I can rest for another 3 seconds, I thought. After all, this horror was far from over. After a few moments, I forced myself to come to my senses and looked around, trying to make sense of the situation. The zombie werewolf was dead, which was a relief. However, I was still chained to the cursed corpse by the chain. Both the blonde man and the doctor, both deathly pale, were busy untangling it, trying to give themselves at least some freedom of movement. A little further away, torn bodies and pieces of flesh lay on the ground. Many criminals and guards were killed. A few managed to somehow escape, and now they were fleeing. The chain, as it turned out, had snapped in half at some point, when the panicked crowd of criminals was dragging me along. That's why it suddenly weakened. If their shackles hadn't had such a complex locking mechanism, I could have tried to break free right now. However, each pair of shackles was attached to a specific link. Without unfastening them, no one would go anywhere. The instigator of this massacre, the main werewolf, was hidden from view by the bright light of the bonfire. However, I could sense its movements through the slight tremors spreading through the stones, as well as through the desperate cries of the inmates who were yet to perish. Angry shouts could also be heard, indicating that some guards were still alive and desperately trying to fend off the monster. But what caught my attention the most was the fact that several maimed bodies began to move. "This is the last thing we needed!" One after another, 4 more corpses slowly rose to their feet. Each creature looked just as grotesque as the first, and no less deadly. The nearest one was only a few meters away from me. Damn it all, I thought. As the air filled with a strange clicking sound, one of the werewolves turned its head in our direction. The blond man fell on his backside, whispering a prayer, while the doctor simply froze in place. I began searching the ground for anything that could be used as a weapon, but there was nothing I could put to use. Fuming with rage at my misfortune, I had to wrap the chain around my finger bones and raise my fists. "Come at me, you freak!" The werewolf lunged forward with incredible speed in a flurry of claws, fangs, and horror. I had less than a second to react, but before I could do anything, I heard a loud bang. The monster, decapitated by a single powerful shot, collapsed helplessly onto the rocks. What just happened? Dazed, I slowly turned my head and looked to my left. There stood a handsome young guard with a determined expression, who had offered me water a little earlier. He looked calm and collected, albeit somewhat grim. His clothes were covered in dirt or blood. Wow, he's cool, I thought, but immediately caught myself. Poser! I mean, he's a poser! With a brief nod, the guard moved forward to confront the remaining 3 werewolves. But after taking a few steps, he suddenly turned around and gave me a piercing look. Then, with a swift motion, the young guard took something from his belt and tossed it to me. "Save yourself!" Saying this, he went to fight the monsters. I reflexively caught the object and watched as the departing warrior. Then I lowered my gaze and examined the item tightly clenched in his hand. It was a short, narrow iron rod with a straight bend at the end. A key. It's the key to the shackles. Casting one last glance at the fierce battle between the young guard and the werewolves, I sank to one knee and began maneuvering the shackles, trying to position my hand correctly to insert the key. It took me several attempts to figure out how the lock worked, but then finally, a satisfying click echoed, and I suddenly found myself free. The cold wind caressed my bloodied wrists. I rubbed them and smiled with a dark glint in my eyes. "Hey, buddy, over here?" The blond man waved his arms in the air, trying to catch my attention. I briefly pondered whether it was worth just leaving him to die, but then changed my mind. In this situation, strength lay in numbers. Besides, despite previous death threats and general animosity from the blond man, I didn't want to leave him chained up, especially since it cost me nothing to free him. I hurried over to the 2 inmates and quickly liberated them from their shackles. Once the blond man was free, he pushed me away and performed a little dance, laughing like a maniac. Ah, finally we're free. The doctor inmate was more reserved. He squeezed my shoulder in gratitude and offered a weak smile, casting a tense glance towards the fierce battle. 2 out of the 3 werewolves were already dead, and the third was missing a hand. yet it still tried to tear its opponent apart. The young guard ran from it, taking cover behind the rocks, and continued shooting, moving with graceful agility as if he were a hero from an action movie. "What are you waiting for? Let's run!" The blond man was already about to bolt, but was stopped by the doctor. "My friend, I wouldn't... If you say 'wouldn't advise' one more time, I swear by the gods, I'll smash your skull." The two inmates stared at each other with undisguised hostility. After a moment, the doctor lowered his gaze and sighed. "If we run right now, we'll surely die." "Why?" The doctor simply gestured towards the large bonfire. "Because without that fire, we'll freeze to death before the night is over. Running away before the sunrise would be suicide." I said nothing, knowing that this criminal was right. In fact, I realized it immediately after strangling the monster. As horrifying as the main werewolf was, the bonfire remained our only salvation in this icy hell. Everything was just as the broad-shouldered inmate had said. May he rest in peace. There was no need for anyone to kill us, because the mountain itself would do so if given the chance. Well, I'd still prefer to freeze to death than be eaten by those monsters, not to mention turning into one of those creatures. The blond man pretended to be brave, but there was no conviction in his voice. He glanced at the darkness surrounding the stone platform and shuddered, taking a small step back. By this point, the third transformed werewolf was already dead, and the young guard was nowhere to be seen. Presumably, he had gone to battle on the other side of the bonfire, leaving us alone near the mountainside. The doctor cleared his throat. The monster may be sated with those it has already killed. It may be defeated or driven away by the guards. Either way, if we stay here, we have a chance to survive, albeit a small one. But fleeing will surely be our demise. So what do? Let's get closer and take a look, I suggested. The blond man looked at me as if I were crazy. Are you out of your mind? You want to approach that monster? I stared blankly at him, then shrugged and headed towards the raging beast. On the other side of the bonfire, things were going from bad to worse. Most of the inmates were already dead. Several guards were still desperately trying to fight the monster, but it was clear they wouldn't last much longer. Right before my eyes, the werewolf grabbed a dead criminal, dragging him along with the chain, and opened its terrifying mouth wide. With one devastating bite, the prisoner's body was torn in half, leaving behind only bloody remnants of the shackles. The werewolf indifferently stared into the distance as it chewed, blood trickling down its chin. Seeing that the werewolf's upper hands were occupied, one of the guards shouted and lunged forward, attempting to shoot the creature. Without turning its head, the werewolf extended its paw, caught the guard's head in an iron grip, and crushed his skull as if it were a soap bubble. Moments later, the headless body was thrown off the cliff and disappeared into the abyss. The blond man collapsed to the ground, overcome with nausea. Then, staggering to his feet, he looked at me. Well, we've seen it, so what now? I didn't answer, contemplatively watching the werewolf, tilting my head slightly to the side. For a while longer, the blond man looked at me, then turned to the doctor. I'm telling you, old man, this guy is insane. How the hell can he be so calm? Shh! Speak quieter, fool. The blood drained from the blond man's face, and he slapped himself, covering his mouth with both hands. Then he cast a frightened glance towards the werewolf. Fortunately, the creature was too busy feasting on the inmates, lucky ones who were already dead and unlucky ones who were still alive, to pay attention to us. The blond man breathed out slowly. Meanwhile, I pondered, assessing my chances of survival. It was obvious that this creature wasn't going to leave until it killed us all. And what am I supposed to do? How do I get rid of this thing? I had neither special abilities nor an army ready to bury the werewolf under a mountain of corpses. I didn't even have a weapon to scratch this monster. I shifted my gaze and looked past the creature, into the endless darkness of the moonless sky. As I gazed into the night, a bright flash streaked through the air and collided with the werewolf, showering it with sparks. The young guard, the heroic savior, had just hurled a burning piece of wood at the monster and now defiantly raised his weapon. "Face me, devil." A distracting maneuver, just what I need. Since I didn't have the means to kill the werewolf with my own hands, I decided to enlist some help. A human wouldn't be able to handle the monster, so instead, I planned to harness the power of nature. Since I can't deal with this bastard myself, let's make gravity do it for me. I was just contemplating the details of the plan when the young hero's foolish bravado provided me with an opportunity. Now it all depended on how long this pompous idiot could stay alive. "Follow me," I said, running towards the far end of the stone platform, where a huge boulder stood dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. The blonde man and the doctor exchanged dubious looks, but then followed me, perhaps mistaking my calmness for confidence or divine inspiration. After all, it is well known that crazy people often do something unusual. Behind us, the young hero guard deftly dodged the werewolf's claws and shot at it. The bullet slid off the creature's dirty fur without leaving a scratch. In the next second, the werewolf moved with frightening speed, directing all its sharp claws towards the new annoying enemy. But I didn't know any of this. I ran as fast as I could, getting closer and closer to the boulder. Reaching it, I quickly surveyed the surroundings for other infected zombie werewolves, then headed to the back of the stone. Nearby were large pieces of wood debris. Placing one of them under the boulder for reinforcement, I turned to my companions and suggested using the remaining pieces of wood as leverage. When I give the signal, place them under the boulder and then push. Got it? What? Why? The blonde man stared at me with a bewildered expression. The doctor simply looked at the pieces of wood, then at the werewolf. Surprisingly, the hero was still alive. He looped between the creature's limbs, always half a second away from being completely gutted. Occasionally he shot at the monster, but to no avail. The werewolf's fur was too thick, and its skin too tough for conventional weapons to harm it. A hint of concern appeared on the young guard's face. All the other guards, as far as I could see, were already dead, so it was very important that this one in particular survived a little longer. "Don't die yet," I thought, and to the blonde man I simply said, "You'll see." In the next moment I started attaching the chains to the boulder. A muffled cry rang out, and I noticed out of the corner of my eye that the hero was flying through the air, finally struck by one of the werewolf's blows. Incredibly, the young guard managed to land on his feet, skidding several meters across the stones. All his limbs were intact, but there were several wounds on his body. Without wasting a second, the hero rolled forward, picking up his weapon from where he had fallen, then rolled again, this time sideways, barely avoiding a strong blow from the monster's foot. A roll? Who the hell rolls in such a situation? I thought. At that moment, I managed to securely fasten the chains. Using the shackles, I quickly closed the other end of the chain, creating a sliding knot and a loop around it, turning it into an improvised grip. Now it all depended on my determination, the coordination of my hands and eyes, and luck. Turning to the blonde man and the doctor, who were still waiting by the boulder, I shouted, "Now!" Then, picking up a significant portion of the chain, I stood up and turned towards the werewolf. The hero cast a quick glance at me. His eyes briefly lingered on the chain, then quickly traced it to the boulder. Then, showing no emotion whatsoever, the young guard redoubled his efforts, distracting the creature from me. So he's smart too? Well. Clearing my mind of unnecessary thoughts, I focused on the weight of the chain in my hands, on the distance between me and the werewolf. Time seemed to slow down slightly. Please don't miss, I told myself. Gathering all my strength, I spun around and tossed the chain into the air, like a fisherman casting a net. The loop unfolded in flight, approaching the battleground between the hero and the werewolf. According to my plan, the loop should have landed on the ground near them, so that as soon as one of the werewolf's legs got caught, I could pull the chain and tighten it around the monster's ankle. But my plan spectacularly backfired. It was quite a sight, to say the least. At the last moment, the werewolf suddenly stepped back, and instead of landing on the ground, the loop landed perfectly around its neck. A second later, it tightened, becoming an iron noose. I froze for a moment, not believing my eyes. And then I clenched my fists, restraining myself from triumphantly shaking them in the air. Yes! I shouted in my head. A moment later, the boulder should have rolled off the cliff, taking the monster with it. I looked back to make sure, and instantly became even paler than usual. The blonde man and the doctor had finally managed to wedge the pieces of wood under the boulder, and were now desperately pushing and shoving the improvised lever. However, the stone yielded to the pressure slowly. Very slowly. Much slower than I had anticipated. In a panic, I turned to the creature. Surprised by the sudden weight pressing on its neck, it was already raising its paws to tear the chain apart. My eyes widened. In the next moment, the hero fired the shotgun he had picked up from the ground at one of the werewolf's legs, knocking it off balance and buying us some time. I was already running towards the boulder, mentally cursing loudly. Arriving there, I rushed to the wet stone and stood next to the blonde man and the doctor, pushing the boulder with all the strength left in my small but horribly battered and extremely exhausted body. Roll. Roll, you big piece of crap. The stone shifted slightly, slowly sliding towards the edge of the cliff. Meanwhile, the werewolf was on the verge of breaking free. Now the survival chances for me and my companions were determined by what would happen first. The stone would fall, or the werewolf would break loose. Throwing the guard away again with a deadly swing like an annoying fly, the monster raised its paws to its neck and tried to grab the chain that wrapped around it like a garrote. However, this time the werewolf's formidable physique turned out to be a disadvantage. Its long, terrifying bone claws were perfect for tearing flesh, but not the best tool for precise manipulations. The monster took some time to grab onto the chain without cutting its own neck. By this time, the boulder was almost at the edge of the cliff. Come on, just a little more. The events unfolded swiftly. The boulder finally shifted and began sliding towards the edge, which seemed like an abyss. The werewolf instantly turned towards us, its red-black eyes flashing with rage as it emitted a menacing growl. The boulder reached the edge. The blonde man and the doctor lost their balance and fell to the ground as the wooden pieces slipped out from under the boulder's weight. I remained standing and cast one final glance at the towering monster before I slammed my shoulder into the stone, leaning into it with all my weight. The boulder lost its balance completely and toppled over the edge, scraping heavily against the uneven stones. I stumbled forward and landed on my knees, barely avoiding falling off the cliff. Turning my head to the creature, I gave it a malicious grin. The werewolf attempted to lunge at me, but it was too late. In the next moment, the chain around its neck tightened, and with immense force, it lurched to the side, soaring over the cliff's edge like a rag doll. The creature fell silently into the darkness, as if refusing to believe that it had been defeated by a tiny human. Die, I thought. Then I took a deep, ragged breath and slumped to the ground, utterly exhausted. I lay on the cold stones, gazing up at the night sky. The pain, which I had previously preferred to ignore, began to wash over my battered body in waves. I groaned. The skin on my back, pierced by bony spikes, was particularly agonizing. I also started to shiver, once again overwhelmed by the chilling cold. A dark figure loomed over me. It was the young guard, calm and handsome as ever. His clothes were torn and covered in dirt and blood, but otherwise the young guard was fine. He reached out his hand. "Get up, or you'll freeze to death." I sighed and gritted my teeth, slowly rising to my feet, ignoring the guard's hand. Around us lay a scene of utter carnage. Apart from the three of us prisoners and the young guard, all the other members of our prison caravan were dead. Their bodies lay strewn on the ground, horribly maimed or torn to pieces. Here and there, the disgusting carcasses of zombie werewolves could be seen. The shadows cast by the fire danced merrily on the stone platform, seemingly unperturbed by the gruesome sight. I was too tired to pay it any mind. The blond man and the doctor had already stood up and were looking at the guard with weary apprehension. Whether in shackles or not, they remained criminals, and he was from the guard. Seeing their tense gazes, the guy sighed. "Come closer to the fire, all of you. We need to warm up and discuss what to do next." After a while, the four of us sat around the fire, enjoying the pleasant warmth. The blond man and the doctor sat close to each other, keeping a safe distance from the guard. I sat apart from everyone not because I had any particular reason to trust one person more than another, but simply because I didn't like people in general. After a few minutes, the guard's voice finally broke the silence. "As soon as the sun rises, we'll gather all the food and water we can find and head back down the mountain." The blond man shot him a challenging look. "Why should we go back? Just to be chained up again?" The young guard sighed. "We can each go our own way once we're down from the mountain. But for now, who knows what else could happen, so it's better for us to stick together. We can't keep going up the road because the mountain pass is long and difficult. Without supplies, our chances of making it through are slim. So going back is our best bet." The doctor opened his mouth, about to say something, but then thought better of it and remained silent. The blond man cursed, seemingly convinced by the guard's rational words. "We can't go down and back," I said grimly. All three turned to look at me, their faces questioning. The guard asked me, "Tell me, why can't we go down?" I shifted uncomfortably, feeling uneasy under the spotlight. "Because the werewolf didn't die," I replied. I was sure such a monster wouldn't be killed by a fall from height. Ahead of us, as always, lay a difficult path,